Good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here. It's the occasion tonight of the Fleck Lecture this year to honor the famous microbiologist and science philosopher Ludwig Fleck, whose estate or working papers actually were passed on to the Collegium. We decided to have an annual Fleck Lecture here. Today it's my great pleasure to welcome you, Annemarie Mol, here for this occasion. Annemarie just told me I shouldn't go into too deep praise because then this makes her uncomfortable. I nevertheless have my duty to do a little bit of praise. I'll see where we find sort of medium ground. So Annemarie is an ethnographer and philosopher. She's professor of anthropology of the body at the University of Amsterdam. She is obviously a very well-known international researcher and has received numerous awards. Very fittingly for today, you received a while ago the Ludwig Fleck Prize in 2004 for her book, The Body Multiple. You received the Spinoza Prize, which in 2012, which is awarded by the Dutch Research Council, and lately I hear you were awarded obviously very prestigious ERC Advanced Grant entitled The Eating Body in Western Practice and Theory. Her work in the understanding of science, technology, and medicine has been influential for many debates, in particular also around actor network theory and ethics of care. In earlier work, you studied healthcare practices, arguing that there are multiple realities generated through a variety of practices. And so, as I understand it, and I should confess I'm neither ethnographer nor a philosopher, so you argued that the body is a multiple in the sense that the perspective from different people working on an individual body brings the diversity of perspectives and the diversity of practices of care. And so, as I understand it, sort of the body seen from a perspective of a herpetologist is different from the body seen presumably by a physical therapist. And I actually, again, I'm an amateur here, but I would say that there's also an interesting link that I see to Fleck's seminal book, Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, because I see here the body as a fact is not just given, but emerges sort of in the context of a thought collective, or as you might argue, a collective of practitioners. So Annemarie has written multiple important books. I already highlighted the book, The Body Multiple. And, you know, I'm not going to go through all of it, but let me mention two more. In 2008, she wrote the book, The Logic of Care, Health and the Problems of Patient Choice. And her most recent book is Eating Theory, that was recently published with Duke University Press. So thank you very much for being here. It's a huge pleasure for us that you are here and that you are taking the time and share your thoughts with us. So I switched this.
Well, thank you a lot for having me. It's really wonderful to be here in Zurich, and especially also really gratifying to be able to give a Fleck lecture. My first reading of Ludwig Fleck is a while ago, because I read it in 1979. So those of you who weren't born then realize how old one can get. Okay, good. I'm talking today under the title Styles, Logics, Worlds. I put those in parentheses, intention, the tragic case of cleanliness. And I like always to start by underlining that intellectual work is always collective work. And a while ago, I used to have the faces of the people who formed what we called the Eating Bodies team. But now I have here faces of people of the Clean Collective and a few others who have in different ways collaborated on or done work on clean in conversation with me, or supported me in getting grants or in writing on clean. So their faces are just a reminder also of the whole network that one works in. Huh? We share our brain, don't we? Good. Now I'll do the English thing and tell you what the talk will be about. Well, it starts by linking up with Fleck's idea of thinking styles, thought styles as it has been translated, but I think Denkstile are thinking styles. It's not a noun, it's a verb. I will then move on to versions of clean, which is my current topic. I don't know yet a lot about clean, that's why I talk about it. And then I'll come to talk about the terms in which to talk about it. So really the philosopher's meta thing, in which terms do we talk about the things we try to study? And I'll end with some remarks on caring research. Now, if we go back to the thinking styles, this is not quite perspectives, it's slightly different. It has to do with, the thinking styles has to do with the practices that different scientists are engaged in. One of the examples Fleck gave in one of his articles in 29, and it's memorized by Ilana Löwy, who knows far more about Fleck than I do. You have had her here before. What he pointed out, Fleck, is how if biochemists want to study a microorganism, they want to make really sure that the microorganisms they are studying is exactly the right, is this species. They want their species. So if they doubt if they have the species, they throw it out. And they say, well, I really want to be sure that I have the typical specimen of the species I study. For epidemiologists, this is very different, because if they don't care so much about the boundary between one species and the other, because their practice, not their perspective, their practice is trying to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. So they are very fluid about the definition of what fits the microorganism or not, and if they doubt if you have it, they say, stay at home, or whatever other measure of the time. Good. So given the practice of the biochemist, who studies physiological properties of a microorganism, and the practice of an epidemiologist who doesn't want an infection to spread, what he says in that article, their definition of a particular microbe is different. At the same time, so that would be thinking styles, different ways of thinking about what that particular microorganism is. I've got here diphtheria, which was one of the crucial infections at the time that Fleck was writing and working, also in his laboratory work. Now, he used the word, I'm making a mess of this, sorry. He used the word thinking styles for lots of reasons, but he tied it to you think about the microorganism differently. But that is tied to what you could call styles of doing. And I was experimenting in German with Tun-stil, but I was told off that would not be good German, but it would work in Dutch. Manieren van doen. We move between these languages, and then you think they're similar, but they're always different. Anyway, but if we take recourse in the English, you can say styles of doing, because it's what to include in the research, which specimen of the microbe you think is the microbe, or you take serious as the microbe. And physiology and epidemiology are different types of practice with different aims. So if one person would shift from working in one discipline to the other, they would also shift in how they engage with what they're supposed to do, and also with their idea of, is this diphtheria or is it not? Now, in the book in 35, Fleck gave a slightly different example of what the kind of Denk- und Tun-stile, I still like it, that interests me here. And this was his reasoning from his position in academia. He was not a researcher in a research lab who has to find facts. As I read around a bit more to prepare for this, I came across what some of you may know more about than me. He had wanted to do that kind of research, but he was Jewish and living in the 1920s and 30s, so he was excluded from that kind of frontline research, and he did his research in a hospital laboratory. So he thought from the hospital and not from the front line of writing articles. And I think that has really positively, greatly influenced the way he thinks about what sciences are in a great way. So if you have the diagnostic in that hospital laboratory, your task is not to know some general fact about diphtheria, but you want to know, I've got blood here, is the microbe in there, diphtheria or not? And he has his blood under the microscope. And what he says about it then is how he gives different explanations. He sees diphtheria through the microscope. But what he then explains to a colleague laboratory scientist, or to, say, the general practitioner treating a child, or to the parent, he says, of course, mother, that makes sense at the time. So what he says to all of them is different. For the lab colleague, you use a lot of words. You say specifically how the particular bacteria looks under the microscope, etc., and so on. To the general practitioner, you give sort of medical textbook level knowledge of your time, and to the parent, you just say, yes, it's diphtheria, be careful, and blah, blah, blah. So what we have then, that is another way that that a diagnostic laboratory works. A diagnosis is not a representation of the reality of objects, as a biologist might write an article. It's answer to a question in the reality of projects. It says something about an object. What I see under the microscope is diphtheria. This microbe is diphtheria, so that you could say is a representation of fact, but that's not what it is about. What it is about is to answer the question of people who have either a laboratory project or a medical project or a parental project in engaging with the patient or the child, whatever. So like physiology and epidemiology, what we talk about here is different kinds of practices: laboratory practices, medical practices, in the sense of clinical practices, and parental practices. And in relation to these different practices, knowledge becomes something different, and Fleck would hand these different people different knowledges, different types of knowledge. Now, this inspired some of my earlier work, quite a lot of it actually. I give here a small example. For instance, I've been writing about anemia, and in the clinic, so to speak, between a nurse and a patient or a doctor and a patient, diagnosing anemia can be a matter of looking at the eyelids. Is it white? Or at the nails. But in a laboratory, it's looking at the level of hemoglobin in the blood. So it's a low hemoglobin level. So these are two ways of doing this particular deviance problem, however you want to call it, diagnosis, and they have complex relations between them. That's the multiple that was mentioned in the beginning. They're different, but they're also related. Because in the ideal case story of medicine, the low hemoglobin level in the blood is responsible for the white eyelids. So there is this physiological story. However, in the practice, that doesn't hold. It's not in the practice. That causal relation is a physiological reconstruction. It's not what happens in practice. In practice, you either diagnose in one way or the other. Or maybe you do both, but that's not a causal relation. It's do I go this way, do I go that way? And maybe, for instance, measuring in a laboratory way, if you're in a resource-poor setting, is simply not affordable. Or it's too dangerous to pass on HIV if you cannot sterilize your needles. So then you do a clinical diagnosis, not because it's better, but because it fits your practice. Another Fleck-like example, or another example I've worked on in a Fleck-like manner, is type 1 diabetes and the way to diagnose that. And I'll give you a little picture here of a person measuring or pricking their own blood to measure the blood sugar level. By now there are all kinds of other more fancy technology, but it doesn't matter. There, the whole question is, do you, as a This is somebody doing it for themselves, the patient or the person with diabetes, doing their own measurement. So how does sensing, I may have a low blood sugar or I may be high, relate to measuring? And that is a question that follows on from a Fleck-like reasoning. He never had the time to ask that, or never, that wasn't how he went anyway. But then you can start to explore, this example we used to explore the relation between sensing and measuring. Because in medical anthropology and more widely, there are all kind of techno-fear people who say, oh, the measuring is undermining the sensing. While in the clinic, the diabetes nurse would use the measuring to teach people with type 1 diabetes to sense. So if you sense, if each time before you measure, you wonder, what is it now? You can learn to sense better, etc., and so on. They have complex relations. Currently, however, I'm no longer in the hospital, although there's lots of clean in the hospital to study. If somebody of you wants to do that, please contact me. I would love to talk about that, because the clean in the hospitals is a smashing topic. But I'm studying clean, and with a few of the people in the Clean Collective, and we study clean in urban spaces, private houses, businesses, hospitals, wastewater, surface water, drinking water. That's our current main sites. And in the Netherlands. So I'm in an anthropology department. Lots of my colleagues travel out all over the world. And one of my tasks, something I see my task, is also opening up the so-called West, or Euro-American, or even Europe, and show this endless complexity in situ, in biking distance. Good. Now, what is clean? You could say this is a norm by which to evaluate, is this clean or not? You can also say it's a value to foster, or it's a concern orienting practices. And some of my philosophy colleagues would be very worried about and decide which of these. I just think, okay, these are all words to think with. Which word shall I use when to think with? Now, this particular thing, clean, is not just you following on from what we heard before, is another thing that's not just one thing, like diphtheria is not one thing. But clean has very many different ways in which it can be articulated. So the concern with clean, in a first instance, you can see greatly differs between sites. If you talk with people about urban space clean, it's mainly about litter. People are concerned about litter in the streets, and that's what you could call an aesthetic cleanliness. That is their concern. Now, in the hospital, infection is the most prominent way to be concerned about clean, so that is what you can call a hygiene cleanliness. In the wastewater treatment plants, where we go, the concern is about nitrogen and phosphorus levels and about what they there call micropollutants, and these are all environmental versions of cleanliness. But of course, each site can be opened up. It's like a fractal. It's not one thing in one place. You can always probe, and again and again and again, there's complexity. For instance, in urban public space, I'll just pick that one. As I just said, aesthetics is very importantly, so it's about unpleasant looks in the street, but also about smells and sounds. And you already see the complexity, because the big trucks that go around to pick up the litter or the waste from people make a lot of nasty sounds. Anyway, so there, again, that's to be opened up, which aesthetics. But there's also hygienic concern. For instance, the food waste on a market, that comes with hygienic concerns to clean that. And we recently all experienced COVID measures that were certainly imposed in public sphere that weren't there before. But there's also environmental concerns about not using nasty soaps that would poison plants, birds, and water life, or other ways that in public cleaning are relevant concerns. Now, between types of versions of clean, there can, what I call, be tragic gaps. And one of the most tragic gaps we found is that around cigarette butts. Cigarette butts are absolutely fascinating research topics. Yeah. Because what appeared, at least in Amsterdam, they are not high on top of the list of the aesthetic concerns of citizens. Citizens don't complain about cigarette butts. But of course, Of course, I should never say of course, but they happen to pollute. They're very pollutive. There's lots of very nasty poisons and plastics in them. So the problem in the governance of a city is that the people who are responsible for the governing of the city are voted by people, and they're not voted by birds and fish. So you get this thing that in Amsterdam, those who were governing the city said, cigarette butts, what's the problem? But then you have activists who say, cigarette butts. So there's a tragic gap there that the aesthetic concern and the environmental concern don't overlap. Sometimes these kind of things overlap, but here they don't. There are also tragic tensions, for instance, between hygienic clean and environmental clean. Because however you want it, if you wash your hands, you dirty the water. It's not nice. It can't become nice. It's tragic. And there is also a clash, a tension here between the aesthetic and the environmental clean. If you have nicely smelling soap, which you attach to because it's so lovely, you dirty the water. So these are tensions between versions of clean that don't map onto each other but clash. However, since we're a talk today, a lecture, I don't want to go on endlessly about these kind of anecdotes. You can imagine if you study something like that, there's far more anecdotes. But I thought, let me do something different and really link up with the Fleck theme. And I have been talking so far about what I call versions of clean, but how do you differentiate versions? And in which language? So what I would like to do now, instead of further pushing the cases a lot, I asked the meta question of how to do so, in which language, how to talk about difference, which analytical tools to use. Now, the 20th century saw, on the one hand, a proliferation of scientific disciplines and streams, and one of the first responses to that in the early 20th century already was a call for holism. And the holism call was called, you have to integrate different aspects. You have to find unifying concepts. You have to put it all together. Now, Fleck was so very original that because he went against that deep desire to add it all together and to do interdisciplinarity by making one picture. I've got images here that were made for us for an article that we did about COVID multiple, where the one image shows this holism fantasy to integrate it all. Now, the other thing to do is to differentiate rather than do holism and to live with and learn from differences. And the thinking styles are one of the ways of doing that. Is rather than starting to say we have to make it whole, to say let's open it up and learn then. And that's a very different way of approaching things. Now, Fleck was not the only one in the 20th century, and I started to amuse myself with making a little list of words, and that was far longer, I spare you half of it, but of different terms that different scholars came up with to do differentiation games. Not games, I shouldn't say games, but they're games. So just like my wool there can be differentiated with the term color, we have the word color for that. We have all kind of words to differentiate in academia, differentiate with. So I start again with the thinking styles, but Kuhn, drawing on Fleck, used the paradigms. Foucault came with discourses and epistemes. Others have used that as well. We have the Wittgenstein language games. Later we had ontologies, or modes of ordering, logics, economies of worth, repertoires, and world. So these are all, and I know you have all very different backgrounds. For some of you, you will with every word say, oh, that's that book. Yeah, that's that book. And others will say, what a mess in the social sciences. But anyway, These are all words that have different backgrounds and different strengths and different things they were meant to do. Now, again, that could be a book-length analysis to differentiate them and do a nice history of the intellectual project in the 20th century of differentiating. But I have luckily the excuse of time to not have to unpack the whole thing, but I'll unpack a few things for you. So what these terms do or had to do. Of course, you could bend all these terms and make them do slightly different. So what I say they do here or had to do is what I sort of learned from where they come from. And now I begin each time by doing a verb that's particularly close and closely related to that particular differentiating tool. These are analytical tools. Now we have the Fleck thinking style. Obviously, the crucial verb here is thinking. And one thing I didn't put foreground here, but that was important for Fleck, and that is also important in many of the readings of Fleck, is that these thinking styles, one of the reasons he invented that word, is that they could move from the outside to the inside of the sciences and back and forth. So these were styles that were not just physiology or biochemistry or epidemiology. The styles of thinking could move in and out of the sciences. And thinking is almost invariably something to act, as I earlier told. It's to solve a problem. Another word that emerged a lot later is logic, and there the verb is reasoning. So it's sense-making, and it's a way of sense-making that informs practices. And you see that emerge in a much later sociology and other fields. Now, the economies of worth is a term that comes from Boltanski and Thévenot, and that comes out of that the verb there is justifying. They were trying to say, instead of us telling what is a just society and what isn't just, as some philosophers were inclined to do, they looked into the way people in ordinary practices justify what they do. And they differentiated between versions of worth, or rather than what I call here versions of clean. They had worth, and they considered actions in relation to their aims and in relation to the goods strived after in different economies of worth. That were the versions. Now, this is a very different background than the word modes of ordering that rather comes out of a sociology that, where the verb here is ordering, a sociology that was arguing that society is not either order or chaos, but can be organized through different modes of different modes of ordering that can have one aim or many aims. Then again, in the same grandiose, a few lines about a lot of books, what the word ontologies was trying to do is linked to realizing. It was to say that practices, which include both humans and non-humans of all kinds, perform versions of reality. And that was a shock in relation to an earlier monorealism where the idea was that, let's say, diphtheria is one thing here, or anemia is one thing. With the ontologists, you could say, no, in different practice, it is actually something different is handled. It's not just differently known, it's differently in the handling, it's a different entity. Now, the word repertoires has acting, and it has a kind of connotation with acting in the theater, and it relates to traditions of thinking and doing that authors may draw upon, or actors may draw upon in their practices. Worlds. You also wanted worlds. The verb that I put out here is living. Now, world is very funny because, worlds is very interesting because actually in the literature where worlds is used, more recent literature, and this is partly done by fairly radical anthropologists, it's to say entities differ between worlds, and then to say, but is entities actually a relevant term in all these words? Aims different between worlds, but maybe aims is a very Western word. Do actions necessarily have aims? Values, good and bad contrasts are different in different places, but does everybody actually have good and bad contrast? Actually, etc. So about the word world is often used to call up variations on every possible dimension, and of course not in one text, because you get crazy if you do that, but you can sort of, everything that you try to use as a map to differentiate, you can then see that it is itself what I would call an English word. Your yardstick is something that has a specific tradition and comes from somewhere and is not universal. Good. Now, this whole dazzling family of words to differentiate all come with questions, like how these variants are distributed over sites and moments and tasks and people and practices, and also how they are coordinated. Because one of the idols of what you could say Western philosophy is pluralism. Things are either one or many, but these versions can be also entangled in each other. So rather than being either one or many, they can be interdependent and clash at the same time. But so there can be compromises, mutual inclusion. So different authors put more or less, insist more or less on either of these things. I'm not opening that up. What I want to open up is shortly how, if I and others study the case of clean, what these different words, and now I won't make the list long, I will make it a bit shorter, what kind of questions that would help us ask, what it would foreground. Because if we would frame our study into clean in terms of economies of worth, what it foregrounds is the particular words, the particular goods. And to simplify, I hold on to these three versions of clean: hygienic, aesthetic, and environmental. Obviously, you can yourself think there are very many more sort of versions of clean. But if we hold on to hygienic, aesthetic, and environmental versions of clean, in terms of economies of worth, hygienic is a matter of being microbe-free. That's the value. The good, clean, is microbe-free. Aesthetic clean is beautiful. Environmental clean is sort of a version of purity. In modes of ordering, you shift the type of question you ask. In terms of modes of ordering, you ask what is being done. So you don't ask what is the good here, you ask what is being done. Then suddenly, what is being ordered? What kind of mode of ordering is this? So an hygienic mode of ordering is one that fights microbe as if they were an enemy. And you can see that there is all kind of fighting language in a lot of the hygiene world, and you can foreground that. In terms of, if you do your research with the analytic tool of modes of ordering, aesthetics might be a matter of fostering sensual pleasure, aesthetic clean. You foster the aesthetic pleasure of the nice-smelling soap or of the beautiful-looking plaza, etc., and so on. In terms of modes of ordering, what you ask about environmental issues is how are we limiting disturbances? So each time with modes of ordering, what happens here is that you don't ask after the clean, but after the cleaning, after the activity. Let's hold on to clean. If you do your research with the theoretical buzzword of ontologies, what you are inclined to foreground if you talk about hygiene is the reality that's being done when hygiene is being fostered. Now, this is a reality of microbes and microbe-host interactions. That's the reality that's that's enacted in practices of hygiene. The reality enacted, and I mean those are the relevant things, the central relevant core things that happen, microbes and host interacting. In terms of aesthetics, if you study clean in terms of aesthetics, what you are going to study is a reality of signals and receivers and perceivers who are receptive. So then you get the whole stories of learning to be affected that emerged in French pragmatic sociology. If you do ontology as your analytic team and you want to open up environmental cleanliness, you come to talk about biochemical functions and dysfunctions. Now, if you use repertoires as an analytical term, what you are inclined, or what you might be inclined to call to the foreground in terms of hygienic, is what are the intellectual repertoires that ground thinking and practices, thinking and other practices around hygiene. Well, you come up with microbiology, epidemiology, but also with household techniques of cleaning, etc., that are relevant repertoires that define how hygiene should be done, or that have all kind of ideas of what hygienic clean is, or that, so to speak, have the authority around hygienic clean, or that claim authority around it, or inspiration, however you want to call it. For aesthetics, this is very different. Aesthetics, we don't have so much granted the authority of aesthetics to particular scientific fields, but rather to the arts and architecture, and there are all kind of media, new media claiming aesthetic authority or aesthetic inspiration, while the repertoire for environmental cleanliness come out of mostly biological type of sciences, ecology, biochemistry, toxology in this case. So you don't have to remember this. This is impossible to remember. But what I would like to bring across is a kind of sensibility for how different analytical tools make us ask different questions. And this is, in a way, an argument against big theory. The ambition of having big theory is a holist ambition, in relating to earlier in my talk. It's the idea to put very many different things together and hold on to them and know what is going on. While the differentiation style that am I arguing for it? That I'm demonstrating here, that I'm playing with here, is one in which you don't want a definite answer, but in which you want to gather tools that help you to open up particular type of realities and ask new questions about them. So then some of these words would be really relevant for maybe some cases, or for some concerns, or for some arguments if you want to write an argument, let's say, in a waste studies journal, or in a science studies journal, or in a humanities journal, or in a social science journal, you might foreground different analytical tools and run with them. Now, that gives the puzzle which of these analytical tools to use when, and I'm not going to answer it. What I want to point out instead is that if you look at Fleck's analysis, he showed which type of reasoning was used when. For instance, we saw that, I just repeat what we already saw to not overcomplexify again. So the definition of a microbe for a physiologist is narrow, for an epidemiologist is wide. The diagnostic explanation for a laboratory colleague is detailed, for a general practitioner is middle level, and for a parent is only yes. So it's very short. Now, what is interesting, what I really find interesting about that, is that we have thereby the diagnostic laboratory as a model for generating knowledge. So we don't have the traditional science laboratory that a lot of philosophy of science and also sociology of science tend to think about as the icon of what science is, where, let's say, the output is articles. But we have the diagnostic laboratory where the output, the primary output, is not articles, but is a contribution to a practice. So that is what I would like to call caring research. So one of the things that Fleck offered us is a way of thinking about science not as making representations, but as caring for a practice, as contributing to a practice. And what I would like in our research into versions of clean is also to propagate caring research. And I would suggest to others that depending on the type of research they're doing, they might consider what, in their situation, whether the diagnostic laboratory as a model might also be interesting to work with, rather than to put it a bit unkind, the article producing laboratory. So in this particular case, we speak to the projects of municipalities, water authorities, potentially hospitals and others who are also concerned about clean. And that, by the way, also shifts one of the traditional reflexes of the sciences to be critical, because that is an outside position. As soon as you are engaging, critical, you disengage from the practice of the other, and you say, this is power, or that is neoliberalism. I'm sorry, that is a bit too short. But while if you speak to the projects of those who care also about clean, but maybe in different ways, you have to do something else. You have to care as a researcher. And at the same time, while I just claimed we speak to projects of municipalities, water authorities, and others, the way I gave my talk was a talk that speaks to the project of doing research. My talk was only 1/3 about clean or half about clean. The other half was about for the project of doing research. And in the project of doing research, you can wonder which terms to use when. And it's a matter of exploring analytical tools. And I think that the project of research deserves to be taken seriously and to be cared for as much as other projects. And then caring for the project of doing research is also partly a matter of experimenting. So it's not a matter of closing off and being decisive, and from now on we're all going to do this, but of working to see what helps, what works, and where different terms take us. Thank you for your attention and your comments.
So, questions, please. Yes, please.
How would you determine what language to apply before having done the research?
I don't.
Okay.
I mean, we're in the middle of the research, or 1/3 or wherever, and what I do is flag up these terms, partly to think, and how to say this, having done a bit of research, I have sort of an idea what I can find with these terms, but I don't think it's good to pin down your language before you do the research. I think it is a matter of, I like to rather work going back and forth.
Is that an experimental approach, or how would you call this?
If you want to call it experimental, that's fine by me. How we call it could be another word. It could be an experimental, or it could be a caring, or it could be a tinkering. There are various words, again, that we could use there that would foreground and background. But yes, it comes close. If experimental is fine. Explorative is also fine. Yeah?
Thanks.
I cannot follow your definition that hygienic is microbe-free. Because if you do a hygienic cheese production without microbes, you never will get cheese.
Sure.
If you brew beer, hygienic beer without yeast, you will never get beer.
You're totally
so,
right.
I mean, there is some problem in the definition. Hygienic equals microbe-free.
I agree with you, but that's, of course, pathogen-free there then. But that, again, of course, immediately differs where you do it. If you are in beer brewing, it's pathogen-free and it's not microbe-free. If you are in hospital cleaning practices, then they have the pretension to be microbe-free, which, of course, you never succeed in being. And one of the other things is, the other tragedies, of course, is that this hunt for microbes was the idea used to be that was good for health, and we also now know that we need all these microbes also in the human body, etc., and so on. So these things are case specific, but you're totally right. But I think, yeah, for sure.
Hi. Thanks so much for a super inspiring talk. I was wondering a bit about the practical applicability part that you addressed towards the end. I mean, I guess your work is very much about showing us how complexity comes into being, and how different approaches of bringing phenomena into being can clash, but also can be coordinated, right? So, a hypothetical scenario: municipality of Amsterdam addresses you and your team and asks you what kind of advice would you give them in order to, properly align aesthetics and environmental considerations and hygienic considerations. How would you manage to bring complexity down again to, assist in policy making or, practices?
Okay, thanks for that. It's not hypothetical. We have been working for the municipality of Amsterdam. And what they actually asked us is not that. They had the problem, we can keep on cleaning, but the people make it dirty again. You're social scientists, so you're expert on citizens. Please tell us how they, if I go a bit short and unkind, how can they behave properly? So in that case, we answered that question. And with this I did with Mandy de Wille, who was in one of the images. And we went to the park. Here you see the park. And we wrote a text to the municipality and said, well, you are concentrated on the morality of the people and on their behavior. But what we see is that there is a mismatch between the way the park is being used and the infrastructure available. As you can see in the picture, the bag doesn't fit in the bin. And so you might want to think differently about this issue. So we were not consultants. I'm also, if we work with municipalities or wastewater, I always tell I'm not a consultant. By the way, they pay their consultants much better, but it's fine. We work on public money, but so we want to collaborate. But what we often do is shift the question. And so they haven't given us that question of aligning. But we would always, I think, be inclined to. And another thing we did with the municipality is talk about the cigarette butts. And the cigarette butts were very complicated because one of the things we wanted to suggest is that there would be more public, these kind of things where you can put your cigarettes. But that was very difficult because the health section of the municipality doesn't want to encourage smoking. So everything that encourages smoking, so that's another clash. Huh? So I can follow clean, but as soon as you go in real life, there are endless other goods. So more places to put your cigarette butts was not in order. That was a bad advice of us. Because, well, I think it wasn't, but because then you don't encourage smoking, which is a fair enough concern. So you keep getting clashing concerns. Of course, I can't solve that.
Thank you. You've studied care practices in very different settings in relation to very different aspects of life. And I really appreciate your turning care towards research. And I wonder, in the area of research, does care look different from the other places in which you've studied it? Does it have particularities that are worth kind of emphasizing? And what is the relationship between care and critique, or the critical, as you mentioned, in research?
Thank you for that. Well, how to say that? That if I relate it to the previous question, if the municipality says, can you tell us more about how people should behave better? And we say, no, we ask a different question. We could have framed that as critique. We could have also, it's possible to write. Actually, I would like to do that at some point because all kind of policy people keep on taking resorts to a sort of fairly flat version of social psychology instead of taking any sociology or anthropology research seriously. So sometimes critique is not always bad. Huh? It's just if you have these stereotypical repertoires. But anyway, so that is in a sense not being nice. So care is not about being nice. Let's establish that. I mean, there is this sort of Heideggerian care tradition about care is love and not technology. I love technology. And we should, not all technology, but I think that making a contradiction between, a tension between love and technology is not a good idea. So, yeah, how to say that? Using a word that is usually not used in relation to research like care and using it there is in the first instance not to insist on the differentiation of how care for research is different, but to take something along and to draw on some of the strength of that word and work with it there. And then as far as I'm concerned, care is a bit like, it is a contrast with control. So it's not, and it resonates with what the earlier question, it's more experimental. So care is not a linear thing, it's a searching thing. It's also not choice and control are linked. If you can only do proper choice as at least the ideology of choice or the idea of what choice is if you choose it, it also happens. So to believe in choice, you have to believe you can have some sort of control. So care is living with the idea that each time what you do has unexpected effects. So it's a way of acting and not being passive, but of also not being hubristic, but expecting you try something, it may work, it may not work. And if it doesn't work, you readapt. So it's also tenacious. I learned this from the doctors and the nurses, but also the patients in the diabetes research. You always keep going, well, until you die. But as long as that doesn't happen, and even that can be orchestrated in more or less caring ways, as we know. So it's trying again a bit differently, without thinking it will all be good, but without thinking it will all be bad. Try again. Yeah, and that I would hold on. That if you want to use the word care in a different way, go ahead. But for me, that's what the word is about. Yeah. So it's a verb, it's not a noun. I mean, one of the problems in English is that the word care is also the healthcare sector, or the care for mothers and for parents for children. But for me, caring, in the way I use it here, is a mode of doing things.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk, and thank you for providing us with a kind of box of analytical tools we think of. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. My question actually relates is more related to a content level and to your research project with regard to the notion of clean or cleanliness. I have made also research on urban clean areas, especially in Cambodia, and precisely with looking on waste management practices and wastewater treatment. And I figured out that there is always clean is always quite relational, of course, but there is kind of fixed relationship between clean, for example, and in my case, it was nature and green. So, which plops up, for example, in sustainable development goals or in the urban practices and policies, but also when talking to people on streets about their visions about clean. So there is some kind of rather more fixed interrelation or relationship to other terms and concepts. And I was just wondering if you were also, finding out similar with other terms and concepts in relation to the notion or vision of clean in your project.
Oh, that's an interesting. I would like to read your stuff on that. That sounds interesting. I think the resonance with clean and green. I haven't seen that much in Amsterdam, because the park, we did a lot of work in the park. It's not clean at all, but it's green. So the question was how to clean the park. In wastewater treatment, that green is actually dirty. Because one of the things you try to do is, if you get nitrogen and phosphorus out of the water, it's so that you don't downstream have algae growing, which are very green, but kill everything else. So I can totally see that if you ask people about clean, they come up with that kind of stories. But if you look at these particular practices, that was not the association. But it may yet be in one of the sub-projects we encounter. But that hasn't struck me so far in our materials.
Is it on? Okay. Yeah, thank you from my side too. So maybe from a different perspective, you have this difference between hygienic, environmental, and
aesthetic.
And somehow I didn't recognize something that I thought is very important. I don't work on this, so it's just I'm just a normal person. I have the feeling a lot of people will think there is an ethical or cultural dimension here, where you can see that, so pigeons, for instance, or rats, or certain kinds, so not microbes, but bugs, so they are they are thought to be dirty or excrements, or maybe even if they are microbe-free or pathogen-free.
Yes.
And also people, so think of, so was sind die Punker auf Englisch? So Punker, Punk-Bewegung, punks. So people who live in a different way from, the standard way. So people who don't live in houses with, cleaning so there is this kind of norm against the norm thing.
Yes.
And I don't recognize this at all, where I think it's important because when you are asking what am I using when, you're also asking an ethical, cultural question. And so this is an architectural question. So how do you go about this?
In our practices, in the studies we do, we go into more, depending on the case, into more, finer or specific categories. But, for instance, if you do study wastewater cleaning, this morality doesn't emerge. If you study urban cleaning, then, for instance, a punker in this particular classification I work with today, that would be mostly an aesthetic. I would call that aesthetic in a sort of wide sense of aesthetics, where aesthetic and moral objections flow over into each other. There has been a lot of work written on the way people can be devalued as non-clean, and I don't go there, so to speak, so far with this practice. It's just not what interests me. I mean, this also has to do with that in the background of most of these projects. Our concern is with environmental cleanliness and the way it gets squeezed by the prioritization of other types of cleanliness and the way it's dealt with. So it would, but in some of the sub-projects it does emerge as something, how to say that? For instance, if the municipality asks us, why are people making the streets so dirty? That is a moralism. And one of the things we're also trying to do is to think against the moralism. I did a little piece, a sideline piece, on how to avoid talking in moralism terms about the uncleanliness and how it emerges again and again. But it wasn't in this talk. You're so right.
Okay. Let's have one last question here, and then I should also say that after this there will be an apéro, so there will be an occasion. We should, of course, give Annemarie first some time to take breath and gain breath, but then there will be an opportunity perhaps also to address questions to you then. Okay, last.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. I'm part of a research group that looks at inter- and transdisciplinary research, how it can be enabled, how it's practiced. And one discussion that we see very often, both in the literature but also in practice, is between scholars who argue for developing a common language between different disciplinary research and that we should come up with a common glossary, etc. And then other researchers saying, no, actually, such a common language is not even possible. It would mean 100% consensus, and we should rather all become multilingual, so understand at least what the other person means, but without harmonizing everything. So from your talk, I had the feeling you would rather go for this embracing differentiation, but maybe you can comment on that. And related to that, I was wondering, what is your experience concerning designing interdisciplinary dialogues, maybe embracing such a differentiation view?
Okay, thanks very much. You've got my talk right. I think if you want consensus about language between disciplines, that means some disciplines win because others get silenced, or they bend over backwards. And if you have natural sciences and social sciences working together, guess who bends over backwards? One guess. Yes, you got it right. Let me make a slight detour if the organizers are not nervous about the time. I've been working recently on yet another project over the years, which will appear in a book called Eating is an English Word. And that does the same kind of work, but in relation to English. It's not just, it's wonderful that we have English. My German is not very good, and maybe some of you are from other countries as well. We couldn't have this conversation if we didn't have English. So we can talk with lots of people around the world who have had a chance to learn English. But of course, English has a very specific history. It comes with a very specific intellectual baggage. So if we take that as our common language, there are lots of things we cannot say. And I think what we have to do is, certainly as non-native speakers, keep in putting our own words into English and see what emerges and how we can mess up English, making it unclean. And that's not clean, it's not always good. So in relation to interdisciplinary work, I really think it is more fun to find ways of according everybody their own language. And here is this little icon. You might look that up. This was the case of COVID. The article. What we there also say is that if you have indeed a sort of epidemiologist mapping where the virus goes, it would be very different from an immunologist trying to find out how the host microbe reaction is, and yet very different from a virologist who's predicting the next pandemic. So if you want to have then a common language, that already between those three different bio things, that doesn't work. So, but that doesn't mean you cannot translate and cross over and learn together. Now, I have studied how this works in hospitals, because I think hospitals are interdisciplinary always. So you can see how it works between surgeons and internal medicine people, or how it works across anatomy and endocrinology. But that's usually done in the wild. It's not a nice interdisciplinary team. There are all kind of historical ways in which it has been settled what goes to the surgeons and what goes to the internal medicine doctors, or when they send patients to each other and who gets what is the gold standard, etc., and so on. So how you would do that in a team where you make agreements on that, or where you try to do that, I have never tried, and partly I've lacked the courage. Let me say that, because it's extremely difficult and it's tedious and it takes a lot of time, and you have to have people from the different disciplines who are all think that it's worth the adventure and who are open to it. So good luck.
Okay, so it remains for me to thank you very much for this talk.